Hey everyone out there, Dan here, aka the Comic Concierge, and welcome to a brand new series I'm starting as I look through the career of Ed Brubaker. I'm going to do an Ed Brubaker career retrospective. What I hope to do for about the next 20 weeks, so I hope you'll stick with me with this adventure, is going through the career of Ed Brubaker and talking about a number of the different comics that he has done, starting with the earliest I can get into the latest. I'll be going in order for the most part. There'll be some adjustments to that here and there. So I'll be talking about multiple comics. This episode, for example, I'll just be talking about one, but the hope is to kind of look at how much his career has progressed and talk about some great comics. When people talk about and ask, like, who is your favorite comic book writer? I go to and say Ed Brubaker, but the truth is there's a lot about his career I have not read yet. A lot of really notable series, especially a lot of his earlier work. So I thought, let me change that. And, now that I have a comic YouTube channel, it does seem to make sense to include you all in this journey as well. I will say some of his early work is a little bit hard to get a hold of, especially if you don't have it right now. Lowlife, for example, is right now out of print. Top Shelf did do a printing, I guess right now, nearly a decade ago. And it used to be available digitally, but for whatever reason, it's not anymore. Maybe it will come back. Maybe there's kind of changing in the ownership of it. Who knows? However, and there are other books like I'll get into next week that are books I had to get from eBay because I couldn't find them anywhere. Relatively cheap though. At the Seams, I think I got for like $6 on eBay, and then An Accidental Death, which is actually a combination of 3 different issues of Dark Horse Presents. Again, it was like $12. So despite the fact that they're relatively rare, and I think to me an important part of comic book history, doesn't seem like speculators care all that much about them, which I'm all for, but I was able to pick them up. So you may not be able to follow along with those. Hopefully they'll be available in some form or fashion sooner or later, or if you are interested, like I said, I think I still see a lot of copies available on eBay that you can get up relatively cheaply, and I will spoiler and say those were 2 books that I really did like, so I do think it's worth the money for sure. I'll be talking, like I said, not about everything he did, but I'll try to cover really the majority of things, starting with his earlier career, getting into his DC work, his Marvel work, and then what he's kind of doing now with Image in his Reckless series. If there are certain books you feel like I definitely have to cover, let me know in the comment section below. I think I have most of the main stories, at least the main stories I can get, but if there's something maybe that you definitely think should be included in that, I'm all ears. So let's actually get into the book we'll be talking about this week, which is Lowlife. And this is written and drawn by Ed Brubaker. A lot of people don't realize that Ed Brubaker, yes, when he first started out, was in fact an artist too. This came out in 1995, and it was published by both the Caliber Comics and Aeon Comics later in his publishing career. It was kind of going between both publishers, and it's really the first thing that broke Ed Brubaker out. It's not the first comic he ever wrote. I think that was maybe Gumby 3D, for example, but I was unable to find any copies of that. If you're able to find it, check it out. It might actually be kind of cool to see what was Ed Brubaker's first comic or first notable comic like. But this was really the thing that you can tell was the story he wanted to tell, because it's semi-autobiographical about his life and just the trial and tribulations that he went through. And reading this and knowing that, the word that comes to mind is honest when it comes to this story. It is a story that feels very honest. It almost feels like a confession in a way, going through all these bits of his life, talking about what happened. And the main character, Tommy, in this, which is clearly a representation of him, is not a good person. Like, it's a person that you'll end up really not liking for a multitude of reasons. He does bad things. He's annoying. He can be abusive at times, both physically and emotionally. And it's not like it's trying to redeem the character in any way. It's, I think, showing a complete picture of him. When you look at this is a combination of a number of short stories. There was about 4 issues that made up the entire set, and each issue in itself sometimes had multiple stories as well. The first story is about him and this kind of failed crime adventure where he and another individual, when at the time they were kind of low-key drug dealers and things were drying up a bit. So in order to get money, and really they just wanted money for drugs that they could take themselves, his friend came up with this idea of robbing this computer store that would be easy money, have the guy go in the back, pull a gun on him, take his money, get the computer, and you're good to go. However, what they're seeing is that, a life of crime is not a hard one to turn down if one time you're successful, and what happens next. And then you see the futility of his friend as well, and what he's willing to do. You see him kind of going off the deep end. And it's kind of an example of how, the old Ben Franklin's saying of when you sleep with dogs, you rise with fleas. And you saw Tommy really put him in situations where he was, with a lot of people that were not the greatest people in the world. And to be fair, either was he. And this was a combination of stories where story plot wasn't the main thing, wasn't the most important piece of this. This was all about character and really kind of slices of life stories. Looking at this, I saw a lot of people compare this to like Richard Linklater movies, which to me makes a lot of sense. Slacker is something that I kept thinking about reading this, the Before series. For those that don't know, the Before series is done by Richard Linklater, and it's the Before Midnight, Before Sunrise, Before Sunset, and they're really stories that all take place in the day and are just people having conversations. I know a lot of people will think that are awful. I do really love those movies, but again, with Richard Linklater, maybe something more like Dazed and Confused, for example, where you're just kind of hanging out with people that are maybe not always the greatest people in the world. Maybe they are, but they're always interesting and they're always intriguing, and there's always that element of honesty throughout. Now looking at the cartooning here, again, this is Ed Brubaker doing everything on the page, and reading this, it's like seeing just how much indie comics has changed throughout the years. When you think indie comics today, Image and things like that, you realize the fighting factor between what's indie and what's big too is not as big as it used to be. They all have kind of the same access to things. Like, it doesn't cost nearly as much when it comes to making comics, in the sense of like the tools you can use due to things being digital and things like that. This was a complete indie book, all done in that fashion. It makes you realize how much things has changed, like from the hand lettering to the black and white look. This was a true indie book, kind of the style you don't get anymore. This is very much in the vein of a 90s comic. Although not that like the fashion is super 90s, although the hairstyles do appear that way in a way. And I think when I think of 90s, I think what it really gets to in the 90s is that Gen X kind of lack of direction. You see these characters, and that is the continuous thread throughout. There's just this confused lack of direction. They just really don't know where to go in life. They're just kind of getting by, just kind of hanging out. And that's why I think it works, because narratively, yes, it is just the story about hanging out, but I think it speaks to the specific time and place. We have a lot of that in the zeitgeist for movies like Clerks, for example. People just at a store talking. It also makes me think, like, why was it so entrenched into the 90s in that way? Why was that kind of slacker mentality, whatever you want to call it, such a big piece of the culture at the time? Was it simply because there's this lack of progressive movement? I mean, when you think about the 60s, you had all the different protests, the free love of the 70s, whatever you want to compare it to, the access of the 80s. And maybe it was a reaction to that. 80s were big and bold, greed is good, all that type of stuff, where the 90s really brought things down to the basics in a way. And again, I'm speaking as someone who was a kid for most of the 90s. So perhaps this is just the perception of what it was, and it was much more varied than that. That's certainly the case. But I do think this book specifically is speaking to that generation in that way. And, you get other stories. Well, really, the center of this, similar, again, comparing it to the Before series, which is about a relationship. That's the case here with Tommy and Sonny, and they're this estranged relationship where their stories go throughout. And if I had one issue with this book, is that it does shift in timelines a lot. Like, it's hard to really get your bearings of one comes first, what comes second, and Sunny's in the picture, she goes away. I don't know if that's because you have a book that, again, was switching publishers. This wasn't something that was maybe designed to like be a complete series at that time. Trade paperbacks weren't really something that people did to a great extent. I think they were just meant to be, here's one issue, it's complete. And when you put it all together, it's a bit messy to read when you're trying to just figure out where everything is within the timeline. It doesn't necessarily impact your comprehension of everything all that much, but you feel like one storyline is over, then it picks up later. It's a minor issue, but generally, again, it's about Tommy and Sonny. You see that relationship pop in and out a great deal, and the relationship is what you would classify as an unhealthy relationship. There's even times where, again, we talked about it getting abusive. There's later, one of the last stories is about Tommy has this friend who basically, for whatever reason, is all women are attracted to him, and he has this saying about we're all people, and he'll like openly make out with someone even if their boyfriend's like right there. He's just like, yeah, we're all people, that's how we all are. And you just see the jealousy there. But I think what's really interesting too is that I think he's trying to comprehend, like, what exactly are relationships? Are we in fact all people? We don't really own individuals. Are we making a big deal out of everything? And I think that's a thing with this, is that this isn't a book with answers, it's a book with questions and a book with just trying to figure things out, similar to the characters are. And that's, I think, was something I felt rather comprehensive and rather compelling as well. And we look at the art here too. Again, that's another part of this. And I was interested to see, like, Ed Brubaker clearly, doesn't really do art anymore. Was it because he wasn't very good at it? And I don't think that's the case. I think similar to his writing style, his art is very character focused. Most of the attention is on the characters, their design. They kind of have that oversized head in a way, so you can get a lot of expression on the page. Good body language. I do think, though, it's very clear when it comes to storytelling, he was much more comfortable as a writer than he was as an artist. A lot of the words are doing the heavy lifting. There are times where he lets the art tell the story, but more often than not, the words are the ones that are kind of putting everything in perspective. Rarely does he just let the words, the art on the page, kind of tell you what you need. And he does, I think, have the fundamentals of what makes a good artist. I don't think he'd ever be an all-star artist. Anyone that would ever cross over to like a Marvel or DC, if he went that route, he doesn't have that type of style or that ability to really adjust. And the other issue too is that sometimes it felt like the character designs didn't differentiate themselves all that well. At times I thought someone was a character from a previous story, but it was entirely someone different. Maybe that was just because everyone had a similar look to them, because especially when it came to facial hair. I don't know, but and generally I thought the art was solid. It was good. It was effective at what it needed to do. But really what was the star here was the story itself, in the way that Ed Brubaker told it. And looking at his career, knowing what I've read so far, what I see right away is how well he uses first-person perspective. And again, I think breaking down those walls, and it makes sense when this is a story that he's telling, because it's actually real life, to choose that method. I think that would make you the most comfortable if you're telling a story that is relating to what you've done in the past, the actual adjusting things. Trying to tell it in third person, it would be a bit weird. So tell it as it is, change the names, but with that, I think that's why we got that honesty in a way. And he's very effective in that. It's just the naturalistic aspect of the dialogue. Everything feels real. Like he feels like he's talking to you. He feels like he's talking to himself. And that's why, even though there's a lot of words on the page at times, it's always compelling. That's something right from the beginning he was really strong at, was his ability to build dialogue and have characters that were unique and interesting and flawed, extremely, extremely flawed. And as I mentioned, the stories do vary throughout. You have one story when it's him working at this video store, and this weird relationship he has with the owner there, and he's kind of stealing money, but people are worse than he is, and you see him being kind of conflicted in a way. And that's really the thing that you see throughout, is that this conflict throughout, trying to figure himself out. And again, I think that is probably something he was working through as he's writing this, as much as he was when the events happened. That's, again, just something that is me just putting something there that may not be there, but it seems pretty obvious to me. So if you are Ed Brubaker fan, ultimately, when I look at today, I enjoyed this book, did I not enjoy this book? I really did like this book a great deal. It's a really impressive debut, or if you want to call it debut. And it to me, when I'm reading debut comics or any comics, I'm going to think about this book and how well and how much of Ed Brubaker was there at the beginning. It's not the best thing he did. It's a little rough around the edges at times. Like I mentioned, it's a bit messy. It's not as complete. I think he did struggle with endings here and there. And I think sometimes people tend to, especially earlier in their career, when it comes to endings, be a bit ambiguous or have endings that just kind of happen because that's the way life is, which I get, but it's not always the most narratively satisfying. It doesn't happen all the time. One of my favorite endings was actually really a story that's them going to the nightclub and how Tommy was just this awful human being, just kind of got drunk and was awful. And then he went with his friend, and how that ends. And it was a funny kind of coda to that. And there was a good amount of humor here too, dark and twisted humor, but funny humor. And if you have the ability to check this out, if you see it on your shelf or at your local comic book store, at our bookstore, you can get it for cheap online. It was hard to find online. I think the actual eBay price for the graphic novel was $80, which I wouldn't spend that much. Like I said, there'll probably be another printing at some time when you have someone like Ed Brubaker. It would make a lot of sense. I could see this becoming some sort of TV show or something like that. I doubt it at this time, since it's been almost 30 years since this debuted, which made me feel old saying that out loud. But it was great. If you like those movies, like I talked about, Richard Linklater's movies, Clerks, in a way, it's not as, I would say, as sardonic as Clerks or as brash with its humor, but just it very much speaks to that time, the same way that Clerks spoke to that time. But anyways, I'm getting a bit repetitive now when it comes to my breakdown of this, but it does have me excited now because, it was great to go back and see how much of Ed Brubaker was there from the beginning. It makes me wonder, like, where does he go next? When I think Ed Brubaker, I tend to think crime, and this wasn't a crime story. This was a human drama story. This was a relationship story, which now makes me realize when it comes to Kill or Be Killed, which is a crime story but has really successful kind of relationship drama within it as well. It all makes more sense now because I'm like, oh, that's kind of where he started. Like, that's really what was his strength to start off with, and then he evolved into the crime bit. I saw people kind of link this as a crime book. I would not call it a crime book whatsoever. Yes, you have that opening story that deals with a crime gone wrong, but that's really the only one, really. Like, everything else outside of that is just general human drama, relationship drama, dealing with roommates, dealing with a job you hate, was all that type of stuff. So going in with those expectations, if you're going in thinking you're getting, criminal the early years, that's not the case. All right, well, that's it for me for this week. I'll start babbling. Next week, I'm actually going to be talking about, first up, The Accidental Death, which was taking place in 3 issues of Dark Horse Presents. And he did not write and draw that. He just wrote that one with a different artist. And then the second book I'll be talking about in next week is At the Seams, as I mentioned earlier. That is a one-shot that he did. He wrote and drew it. And it was very similar to Lowlife, which is a combination of short stories. So we'll talk about those next week. And then eventually we'll be getting into some of the more notable books. But I figure, let's get into the earlier stuff first, see how things kind of started off, set that foundation, and then we'll get into, the Batmans and the Captain Americas eventually. Thanks for taking the time to check out this channel. Let me know what you think of Ed Brubaker. As I mentioned, what are some books I should check out? Have you read this? Are you interested in it? Let me know. I know there are a ton of comic book channels out there, so I appreciate any comment, anything like that. I thank you for taking the time to do that. It really means a lot. Just remember that comics are for everyone. The key is finding the right one. Until next time, keep reading.